If you want, you can go ahead and turn to the book of Malachi. Um, you're like me over probably the last several months as we've been studying through the minor prophets. This may be a little bit easier for you this go around. I find myself typically having to sing the song in order to locate where we were at each class morning. So hopefully this will be a little bit easier. Um, we will spend um, too much time this morning diving into the actual book, but I wanted to spend our time here initially trying to provide a little bit of context as we begin our study and to give a little bit of a setting, make sure we understand a little bit more into where the book is coming from, what it's meant for, and as we dive into this study. So here's a quick class schedule over the next 4 weeks. This morning, like I said, we're going to be doing kind of an overview of Malachi, and then beginning near more towards the end of class, we'll get started with the first 5 verses in the first chapter. Over the next several weeks, we're going to be looking at a breakdown of kind of there's only 4 chapters, so a breakdown of a few of the chapters each week. It doesn't naturally fall, kind of chapter by chapter in my mind, breakdown for it, but the themes are there. And so overall, our theme for this class, as kind of moving through it and getting out of it, is a wake-up call for all. And you'll see kind of our lessons over the next several weeks geared towards kind of that theme, whether it's to the priest for a few of the chapters or to the people, and then hopefully finally what's more for us as we get to the end of the book. All right, so a little bit of an overview. Malachi means my messenger or messenger of Jehovah. There's a little bit of discussion or back and forth around whether Malachi was more of a description of the author or actually the author's name. It happens to be that the meaning of the name it just so lends itself to a perfect fit for what the intent is here. The intent is a message from Jehovah for his people, and it's being delivered, and we see it in the very first verse, the oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. It's a little bit different maybe than some of the other minor prophets that we studied, where there's future, like within the book, there's reference to that author's name and other circumstances. That doesn't happen as much in Malachi, but there's nothing to suggest necessarily that it wasn't the prophet's name here. But it is interesting that the name does mean messenger of Jehovah. And so the goal here is for Malachi to deliver the word of the Lord to the people of Israel. Historical context. So we just moved off of Micah, and I'll say this here at the front. If you learning and doing the book of Micah over the last probably several weeks, you may hear, and I'll apologize in advance if I end up saying Micah instead of Malachi. Just go with it. You know what I'm meaning, but Malachi falls, quite a bit of time after what we just studied with the book of Micah. We're going to end up seeing a lot of, and we'll get to this in a little bit, we're going to end up seeing a lot of the same message, a lot of the same themes, a lot of the same instruction or issues that the people were having. But it is sometime after. And so it's a little bit probably hard to read, and I knew it probably would be, but this chart just kind of gives a little bit more context of where Malachi is falling. So Malachi comes around about 100 years after the people were taken into captivity. We spent some time over the last several months, even studying from the divided kingdom, leading up to kind of the captivity time frame and discussing some of that. And so Malachi falls itself really towards maybe the latter part of that return from captivity. Some of So I wanted to at least give a little bit of an overview, just a refresher or a reminder of kind of where we're at in that time frame. So it's not obviously it's not going to be the intent of our full study or exhaustiveness in relation to it, but I think it helps provide a little bit of context of where what the people of Israel have been doing, why they may be doing the things that they are doing, and why they're receiving this message from God. So, like I said, it comes after a little bit after the captivity time frame, and so in about 538 is when Cyrus, if you recall, when Cyrus gave the decree for the people to be able to come back to Israel. And so the first group returns kind of in that time frame from 538 to 458. And so you have Zerubbabel who returns and begins the work on the temple. We all remember there's a lot of things that go on from the temple being rebuilt, a lot of adversity that gets faced. The contemporaries in that time frame that kind of give us that message come from Ezra, Zechariah, and Haggai. And we see finally, after probably close to 20 years, the temple is finished in 516 BC. And then the second group is led back by Ezra. And so Ezra, in his time frame, and been helping the people return, he goes about kind of pointing out to the people, especially messaging for kind of like getting some of the original, call them the things that they may have forgotten, especially in regards to priests and Levites and things like that in their time of captivity. So Ezra sends for the Levites. He sets up the priests who are intended to guard the burnt offerings. That's one of the messages in Ezra chapter 8. And then the other thing we notice even in this time is that the people started having trouble with intermarriage. And so they've returned back, but there's still the nations around them. And they see a lot of struggle, even at that time, in some of the message from Ezra is their issues with intermarrying between those other nations. And then we kind of get to what is probably more around the time frame for where the book of Malachi is written for. And so from 445 BC to 415 BC, we have where the wall is being rebuilt. And a lot of the message here comes from the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah serves somewhat of as a contemporary to Malachi. And we believe that or see that in that there is a lot of the same difficulties or messaging that's being brought out in the book of Nehemiah. So going back to the first 6 chapters of Nehemiah really focus on the walls being rebuilt to the city. And then in Nehemiah chapter 8, a really big event happens for the people. You recall Ezra finds the book of the law and reads it for everybody. And they realize, a lot of, hey, this is not who we've been. This is not what we've been keeping. And so you start to see that rededication towards some of those things. And in chapter 12, they actually dedicate the wall. But we find pretty quickly thereafter, Nehemiah starts to point out and rebuke the people for a litany of kind of issues that he's starting to see, including profane worship, withholding what was due to the Levites. They're originally supposed to support the Levites and provide them with what they needed. They were profaning the Sabbath and not keeping working on the Sabbath, keeping it holy. Like we saw a little bit with Ezra's message, they started marrying with foreign nations and intermingling with nations contrary to what they had been instructed. And then you see in you want to turn over to Nehemiah real quick in chapter 13. Nehemiah explains what some of the reforms that he's trying to put into place. Nehemiah chapter 13 and then in verse 30. It says, "Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits." And so you can see here Nehemiah um, trying to reform some of the things that he's seen the people kind of stray away from, or some of the things that they were doing at that time. And we're going to see a lot of those kind of these lists, and what we're going to focus on when Malachi starts speaking specifically to the priests and to the people, a lot of the same issues. This map right here is just to give a sense of where the people returned to at that time. And we already talked that they were intermarrying with other nations. And you can see, if you think back to even Israel and even the divided kingdom, kind of where they made up. I mean, Judea right here is completely surrounded by other nations. The Edomites, who we'll talk a little bit about here coming up, had even moved further north, taking up a lot of what would have been Judah in the past, and encroaching upon kind of where the Israelites were at this time. And you still have Moab and Ammon close by. And so they're in a situation where they've returned, but they are still surrounded by other nations, surrounded by their influence. So all that being said, in that time frame for their return, I think the thing that I want to impress on everybody is that they really, they had come off of a lot of things changing, the temple being rebuilt, the city being restored, the walls being rebuilt, a lot of what you would think as positive, energetic, important things that really should encourage and get people moving in the right direction. And it's what I want to impress upon everybody is it didn't take long for the people to forget a lot of those things and to really move kind of in the other direction, to start doing things that have to be pointed out here in Malachi by the message of the Lord. And so that leads us to kind of some of the themes I want to bring up for the class over the next several weeks. The first theme is that we're going to see a pattern kind of repeat itself. We've seen, whether you go all the way back to the time of Judges, if you go back to all through our studies through the kings, the divided kingdom, you see a pattern kind of repeat itself where the people start to fall away. They get rebuked, and whether the rebuke happens in the form of being taken over by another nation, if it happens in ultimately taken into captivity, as it did after the divided kingdom, or in just messages brought to the people, you'll see that the people get rebuked, and then God brings kind of judgment, and then at the end, God restores those who repent. And so our study, really over the next several weeks, will follow. If you notice the chapter references here, actually outline to kind of the class schedule that we looked at the beginning. Doubt God shows for his. They doubt God, shows his love for his people, and that's in the first few verses that we're going to be looking towards here in a little bit. They choose to sin and disobey God. Chapters 2:10 through 3, we're going to see God rebuke and judgment, and then towards the end, we'll see him restoring those who repent. And so it's a pattern. We see this pattern all throughout the Old Testament. That's why, really, Malachi, in my mind, is a very good, really book to kind of wrap up the Old Testament. It's got a lot of transitional nature to it. This pattern that you see is really representative of a lot of what happened in the Old Testament. It's kind of summing up a lot of things that we've seen that went on in the Old Testament, this specific pattern in mind. And then it will start to point towards the New Testament in some of the promises that are made that will lead the people away from this pattern. I'll pause right there just to get anybody's thoughts or comments around some of the context of the book, or even the theme of a pattern coming up. If I'll say this, this first lesson, I know I'm going to be doing probably a little bit more of the talking, but the intent over the next 4 weeks is to hopefully get into some things that we'll be able to have a good discussion on. A lot of application, a lot of taking some of the things that we're seeing here in the book of Malachi and the messaging, and asking how that kind of applies to us. Yes, Ms. Trish.
It's almost like genetic spiritual memory loss, because it's the same pattern over and over. And stories were passed down from generation to generation, and they knew how bad it was when God punished. And yet, this is a perfect example of coming back into the land and starting to do what God wanted them to do. And like you said, in no time had fallen away and were in the same place they were before, ready to either be rebuked or punished.
Oh, that's right. I said, didn't take long, and that's what we see here. It didn't necessarily take a lot of time, or and one of the words you used there, yeah, and we'll get into it. I think what I've kind of phrased it as, there's just kind of almost like a lack of awareness that that is a very big struggle for the people of Israel at this time, that gets brought up, and we'll spend some time talking about what that leads to in their lack of awareness. Yes, sir.
I guess one of the things that impresses me, and we do it today, about the book of Malachi, was the amount of argument he got from the people he talked to. How did we slight you? How did we not obey you? Why did this? And he goes to great lengths to explain that to them. We don't get a lot of impression that they listen very well. But what's different today? God tells us what we need to do, but do we listen? Most of the time, we hear it, but does it really take effect? And that, in the book of Malachi, he gets rather serious with them. I told you. And they come back and say, well, what do you mean? We didn't do that. You don't argue with God that they wanted to.
No, definitely. That leads someone into our next point. I'll let her make a comment first, and then we'll move into the next theme.
I was just going to say that I think it's interesting looking out at the outline of the book, just as their sin starts with the doubt of God's love, that's what he addresses first before he rebukes and reprimands them. He reminds them of his love for them. And I look at, we can learn from that in so many ways, that a lot of the time I think our sin starts with, even if we don't consciously recognize it, doubting God's love for us. But if we're constantly reminding ourselves of his love for us, it's harder for us to slip into sin. And so for us, when we doubt, that's a dangerous place to be. And then also, when rebuking others, it's always best to start with love and not only reminding the person that is being rebuked that God loves them, but that we love them and that the rebuke is coming from a place of love.
All right. Between Brother Murphy and those comments, class is over for the rest of no. Those are great. That's exactly kind of what we're about to move into, really, on whether the overall theme of Malachi and even into the first few verses of the first chapter. A lot of it we're going to come back to will be geared towards our relationship with God. Whether I think we see an example here, and it's to Brother Murphy's comment, like it's a pretty stark example here of that interaction between God and his people, and some of the ways in which they respond. And I think there's a lot to learn from not only our relationship, maybe even with God and the people. I mean, just a few of the things high level that we're going to dive into. I mean, she already mentioned it, but first one being doubt that comes right into picture as God starts to explain his love to them. They ask, "How have you loved us?" This whole book of Malachi, I mean, most of these, there's still more questions, but we'll see all these responses, and it can be shocking even at times, just the way in which the people respond. And it says a lot about how their relationship was, and there's going to be things that we can take from that about, you know, are we behaving in the same way or asking the same questions? There's defiance and indifference. How have we despised your name? How have we polluted you? There's weariness. Question, what a weariness, or the statement, what a weariness this is, when referring to kind of as God is talking to them about the things they've done. There's questioning about his justice and judgment. Where is the God of justice? And then there's neglecting. They say, you know, how have we robbed you? Later in chapter 3. And so you see a lot of back and forth between the people and God. And there's going to be things that we're going to be able to learn from their relationships. You see the people's stubbornness and disrespect at times. And then this is going to be very contrasted by the love and patience that God has for them. And, you know, we'll get to hopefully more in depth in our own conversations, but I think that's evident probably in all of our lives, where at times we may be stubborn, we may be disrespectful, but God continues to be patient and show his steadfast love for us. And then there's lessons for us in just all of our relationships. I know we're going to be mostly talking about the people in their relationship with God, and you know that how that plays into our relationship with God. But there's also things to learn, and we've already talked a little bit about it, but in our relationship as parents, in our relationship as children, and in our relationships with each other. You know, what we see here a lot is that father-child dynamic between God and his people. There's multiple times throughout the book that statements as father, son, servant, master. There's definitely that dynamic that gets expressed all throughout Malachi. And given that father, son, parent-child relationship that we see between God and the Israelites, there's going to be things that we can pull out of that for any of us who are parents or choosing to become parents to learn from. And like I said, overall, the theme kind of hopefully is stirred towards a wake-up call for the Israelites. The message was to bring them out of the things that they were doing, to turn them around, to, you know, you see the back and forth and the contrast between how they're interacting with each other. God doesn't hold back. Like, he's, you know, honest with them. He responds to their questions with the hopes of bringing them out of the mindset that they have at that time. And I think what you see from the questioning and what we're going to see from the book, that mindset is a very self-centered and a lack of an awareness that's going on. And so it's intended to be a wake-up call for the people to bring them out from that. Yes, sir, Brother Willis.
I was always taught to look at the word choices in Malachi, and it starts with the prophet saying in, I think the more recent translations, the oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel in Malachi. In the older versions, like the King James Version, it says the burden of the word of the Lord. That was not an uncommon phrase for a prophet to start off with. The idea of the burden was, this is a thing that I must say. I cannot not say it. I have to do this. And so it's very direct. It goes right to the heart of the matter of them immediately. And so it's a clear, I'm in your face talking to you about the things that you're doing that bother me. And so the later versions call it an oracle, which is what it is. It's a back and forth with Malachi speaking the words of the Lord. And so you get a real dialogue and impact of what the prophet wants to say and needs to say. And the things that happen after this, during the silent period when there are no prophets, they go right back to where they've been on these accusations. So it's pretty impressive that the prophet starts out very direct, but that's the mission God set before him. So burden was not a burden to say it. It was just that it had to be said.
I agree, and I like the burden idea there. I mean, it had to be said, and then I think it's also part of the burden, while it had to be said, is it's not an easy message. It wasn't, and that's a lot of the prophets throughout all of their messaging. It wasn't going to be something that was roses and you're doing a great job. No, this is a very, very direct, very specific message to the people, and it was going to be hard. And to go along with some of that as well is, we've studied from various minor prophets, and a lot of the, from a stylistic standpoint, a lot of the messaging may be using imagery and terminology that, while familiar even to the people, at times even for us, it takes a little bit more study and a little bit more understanding, and to try to glean from it, to understand, contextually even what the prophet was referring to. This is very direct. This is very, very specific, very, I'll say, not overly simplistic, but the back and forth here between God and his people is to get to the point, to point it out to them. And I think part of that was because of who the people were at this time. And you see that in their responses. The responses are saying, they're questioning God, they're being disrespectful at times in their responses to him. And so when you're having that conversation, you have to almost be direct with that type of person or that type of people. And so I think we do see that in at least the approach for Malachi. One other, let's see, yeah, let's go ahead and let's turn to, if you haven't already, turn to Malachi, the first chapter. And we'll go ahead and start to look at the first 5 verses. Do I have a volunteer who would like to read the first 5 verses? Brother Walton.
Malachi chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. The oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you loved us? Is not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord. Yes, I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated. I have laid waste his hill country and left his heritage to jackals of the desert. If Edom says, we are shattered, but we will rebuild the ruins, the Lord of hosts says, they may build, but I will tear down, and they will be called the wicked country, and the people with whom the Lord is angry forever. Your own eyes shall see this, and you shall say, great is the Lord beyond the border of Israel.
So we started to kind of talk about a little bit of how this book begins. But with that first phrase, when he says, I have loved you, want to make sure everybody's clear. While in our language, tense-wise, that's got a kind of a past tense phrasing to it. That's not what this word here means. It's more of, I've loved you, I am still loving you, I will love you. It kind of goes across all aspects of the time period. So God is immediately starting this off with how he feels for the people. Do you think he had to expressly say it? So why? I talked a little bit about why do y'all think that he does start this way? In so they maybe quickly forgotten. I mean, they have some. They did get out of captivity. They did return. They did, rebuild and had a kind of returning to some of the things that they had learned in the past. But, I think there is a motivating factor with starting with this expression. I think, while we don't always have to say it, and we'll move here in a minute to, people's question and the next points with God giving examples and demonstrating his love. But I think it's important. I think it's not just for their understanding of what's motivating here, but I think it's for ours. I think he wants to establish from the very beginning, and like we've got the entire scripture. We have the Old Testament. We've seen everything. We've already talked about the pattern that repeats. But some people, if not most people, respond better to things being expressly said. I think there's the 5 love languages that go around, and one of them is words of affirmation. I would think in most of our relationships, the people who we do love probably know it, but it still helps to hear it. I think it still helps to start things off with that. Brother Willis.
And I think we can all remember those kinds of events in our life when a parent spoke to us and said, where is my honor? The 5th commandment's what's being reminded of here.
Yeah. No, that's what I'd even written down. If you go all the way back to Exodus 20 and look at the 10 Commandments, this does harken back to what, from the beginning, what he's expressing is, a love for a father and his child. And that's the relationship that we were talking about. And, we have probably a group that in here that most are parents or have children. And once you start to have a difficult conversation with your kids, I probably wasn't like this for definitely near the beginning, and then sometimes it's very difficult because you are maybe frustrated or even disappointed in what's going on. But oftentimes it's best to start out that messaging before you start to get into those things with a statement of love. Help your child understand, what the motivating factor is, where you're coming from with that rebuke that's going to happen, where you're coming from with the lessons that you're about to hopefully help them learn. And it's motivated by that love that you have for them. Sister Trish.
I don't know how many people came back out of captivity who had actually lived under the law. I've always thought I'm so lucky to not have lived back then, because it was a difficult, because everything was so specific and had to be done, and this you could do and that you couldn't do. So you've got 99.9% of the people who came back from captivity have never lived according to God's law, because they couldn't get to Jerusalem, and they, after a while you just do what you want to do. So now they're back, and it's hard. It's not easy to keep the law, and maybe that was part of the Levites' problem. They weren't instilling the law in the people like they should. But I tend to think, how could they be so dumb? They've seen this happen over and over, but this generation had not seen God's law in action because they were in captivity the whole time. So it was kind of a slippery slope when they got back to Israel.
I think there's
But
an
that's
element
no
of that.
excuse.
I think there's an element of that there where, yes, maybe the law keeping is difficult, or they hadn't been around it coming from captivity as much. However, I think that they would still have an understanding of God's love from what they had seen and what they've been a part of, and while that may be difficult, they should know, or be seeking the ways in which to make sure that they're obeying what He's established for them. But then the next point really goes even the next step from it. It wasn't just that they were not following the commands of the Lord, or not doing those things. Their response shows kind of where their attitude was at, right? You go back to the second part of verse 2. It's not just that, hey, okay, we understand we were doing something wrong. They have the disrespect or dishonor to go ahead and question God's love for them, and put out, how have you loved us? And so I think it shows that the people's response here, we talked about kind of awareness as well, but I think that it shows almost a lack of awareness of one, what God truly has done for them, but two, where they are at in the things that they're doing. We're going to see this with a few other of the responses along the way as we get into God specifically pointing out the things that He has taken issue with, but they are pretty disillusioned with who they are as a people and what they've been about and what they've been doing. And because of that, I think lack of awareness and disillusion, their responses to God are ones of disrespect or even doubt. Aaron?
In Matthew chapter 12, in verse 34, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and says, "How can you speak good things when you are evil? For the mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart." In Malachi chapter 2, I know I'm getting a little ahead, but he talks about how they didn't take his words to heart. The problem that they're having, that he's addressing in Malachi chapter 1, is that they are not capable of seeing good things because of the attitude that they're holding in their heart. They hold a contempt for God in their hearts. And because of that, nothing that God does for them is going to seem good. So the very first thing that God has to do in the first 5 verses is to correct their perception and to correct the attitude of their heart. Until that changes, and unless that changes, they will never see anything good from God.
No, it's definitely all of their responses, yes, I think are great evidence of where their heart was, and the contrast of where God was coming from, and how He's starting this with love and the grace that He has. Brother Murphy?
One of the writers in his overall discussion of Malachi, he says, using the question and answer period method, Malachi probes deeply into their problems Listen to this list: hypocrisy, infidelity, mixed marriage, divorce, false worship, and arrogance. Now, Malachi wasn't the first prophet that came to God and talked to these people. He's probably down the road in a long list of prophets that have been back, and we've studied about those. And yet, these people have still degenerated back into this worldly fashion, and all these are pretty serious things that he's addressing them with, that he's accusing them with. And yet, today, did we not do the same thing?
A pattern repeats.
We need to read that with respect and understand what God says about those things. He said it to the Israelites. He's saying it to us too.
You make reference to the Pharisees and Sadducees. I mean, he says it gets brought out even in that time at the early, at the beginning with Jesus coming. I mean, it was a lot of the same attitude that came along, and we're no different.
This whole thing, I can't help but think of the parent-child relationship, as we've already talked about, and it reminded me of when our daughter was in her teenage years in a very rebellious state. And sometimes I think just as the people of Israel, they were so lost and so off course. And I think the reminder of God's love is important, because even his judgment and his correction is so that he can train a people up, just as we want to train our children up to do good, for them to realize the place of blessing is with God, not apart from God. But I also remember being outside my daughter's door praying, just her stubbornness, her rebellion, and I would have this revelation, oh, Lord, sometimes I'm like that, aren't I? And, just this picture of sometimes I'd see things in my daughter and I'd go, oh, Lord, sometimes that's me. And I'm just grateful I don't live under the law, and I'm reminded that I think it's in Ezekiel. It says, I will give you a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone, and I will write my laws on your heart. And just the reminder of the new covenant, although all these things God still desires. I mean, everything under the 10 Commandments, Jesus even raises it to a higher standard of who we're supposed to be. That out of our heart comes our actions and our words. But I think just the overall picture of God's love, whether it's in blessing or even to remember that in judgment and rebuke, it is always out of love and desiring for a people, a child, to return to him.
Very good. I mean, I think, like you said, all of this is still a heart issue. Yes, the things that are going to get pointed out are specific to things that go all the way back to the law being given to them, the things that they were supposed to be doing, how God had ascribed worship in the ways that they should be worshiping him. But driving factor in why they weren't doing those things were a lack of a heart mindful of the things God did for them, a lack of understanding of what had been done and what would continue to be done for them each and every day, and those things harken back to where your heart is at, and being mindful of that love. I think we're hitting time. We'll continue next week a little bit more in these first 5 verses. Look a little bit at God's response to them, and him bringing it really all the way back to the beginning, and explaining his love. And then we'll start to look a little bit more into the wake-up call for the priests at that time, and maybe what that means for us, specifically for